So I, in that sense, I feel that yes, I mean, while it would be problematic for a caretaker setup to, to take on further loans or make those commitments, and there's been some tinkering, to allow it to continue, economically negotiating with the IFIs, given the desperation of the country. But the current standby arrangement is a standby arrangement, right? And the idea, I think, even the bank and the the IMF in particular realizes that they, need to have continuity of policy, and that's why it's a short-term loan for now, till the next government comes in. So that to me is of less concern. And now I'm sort of, moving in the direction of your second question, because the other political economy questions, that the caretaker set up, and not only the caretaker set up, by the way, I mean, even the so-called coalition government, had started making moves which were quite, quite contentious. So, for instance, this idea of corporate farming, which in its own right has a lot of issues, in a agrarian elite captured, sort of highly skewed rural economy that is Pakistan, trying to do corporate farming, besides the efficiencies argument, is, it does not create a lot of rural employment because it's a capital driven, sort of productivity strategy. So, so it's not only corporate farming, it was the allowance of 45,000 acres in the Punjab, to the military to undertake corporate farming. So, how that corporate farming in itself might not be, panacea for rural development and addressing rural poverty and food insecurity. And then the fact that the military is doing it. So, and of course, we have a very long history. People like Imran Ali, I mean, the economic historian, did a great job, and others prior and subsequent to him in highlighting sort of, the colonial legacy, right? So how the British had started giving lands. I mean, for them, it made sense, right? I mean, it's like, that's why the revolt in the Punjab didn't quite take, because, there were all these like canal economies. But essentially, they had started giving land to war veterans, right? To the recruiters. So, I mean, there are, if you think back a few generations, all these colonels and whatnot who had these huge land grants given by the colonial administration, not having even gone into warfare, but they were great recruiters, large landowners, and they were sending a lot of, people, even in World War I and World War II. So, so that precedent, and then the Ghodapal scheme, right, and the livestock farms, then created, I mean, they stayed basically even after partition. And we saw a few years earlier, in Okada and elsewhere, the sort of troubles around trying to change the nature of sharecropping into leasing, right? And it became this big thing during the Musharraf era. So now, if we have decisions like these being taken, right, and there was some sort of judicial, pushback, but I think then even the judiciary conceded the last I checked. And, if plans like that go ahead, right, and the military's imprint on the political economy is already significant. Yes, it is the strongest institution in the country, but it didn't become competent or organized, just naturally. I mean, it did so because it takes on so many of the resources of the country, right? I mean, if you look at the allocation, the budgetary allocation. And of course, there are security concerns. I mean, we don't live in the most friendly part of the of the world. So these are complex issues and intertwined issues. But ultimately, now the military sort of positioning itself, even more firmly in the economic sphere, raises sort of concerns, around capacity, around approach. And this is an escalation, it's not something that doesn't have precedent. I mean, it has precedent preceding partition and, of course, subsequently. I mean, even with the CPEC authority, I mean, the military was already deeply engaged with China, on that BRI.
Absolutely. And here I would just like to further elaborate that it's not just economy in terms of making revenues or generating revenue, but also in terms of the strong say in how the economic policy is formulated and what are the foreign/economic policy engagements with other partners, whether those are, multilateral organizations, development banks, or whether those are multilateral partners, because we've seen very regularly that the chief of army staff is on a state visit to either Saudi Arabia or China, and he's very actively involved and engaging those deals, being at the forefront of them. And therefore, it really highlights the question and brings about it further that this caretaker government may be, another leverage point for the army to execute the economic plans that they've had manifested for Pakistan, or what they had idealized, or the vision that they had. But on that note, I want to go back to the former part of your answer, where you mentioned about usually for a government who's ending its tenure and prior to the election period, engaging in any austerity measures, getting rid of subsidies, even though they're market-failing subsidies, is basically political suicide. Because if you hike the price of the petrol, if you levy additional electricity tariffs, there's very little chance that you will be re-elected into power. And therefore, Pakistan, unfortunately, is in a peril at the moment where we need some stringent measures, some strict measures, and therefore the caretaker government may be, I don't want to use the word breath of fresh air, but might be suitable in this time of need where other democratically elected parties or governments may not have had the will, the intent, or maybe even the power, the courage to undertake these reforms. And another, on the flip side, what I wanted to put forth towards you, that obviously there's this democratic element that can be, that is traded off because they're not elected into power. But what we've seen in this particular caretaker government as well, that we have some individuals who are very well internationally recognized experts. I'm just quoting a few names here. Umar Saif, for one. He has a doctorate and a postdoc from MIT. We have Shamshad Akhtar, who was the chair of the UN's ECOSOC, and there are other such individuals. So isn't this a good thing for Pakistan to have such people on board and, steer the wheel for a bit, stabilize the country? Because when we go back to elected governments, then, obviously there's a give and take. There's clientelism, patronage is awarded, and there's some corruption that seeps in as well. So on that note, what do you think? Is there some silver lining?
I mean, these are people who have been, the former, ambassador to the US, and again, the ambassador now, Ambassador Jalil, again, also a competent person. But these are people who, might have been appointed by different political parties, might have political leanings, but there's no reason why we cannot have, these people in positions of power, even otherwise. Yes, there are broader vested interests. There is, political patronage, etc. But I think, issues like corruption, etc., they're so endemic and so structural that, just having a technocrat, at the fore for a few months is not going to be able to grapple with those types of issues. So, so I wish that there was a quick and easy fix, that Pakistan would be put on the path of progress. But if we're going to have an elected government subsequently, we often see the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, right? If you remember when the donors also got behind General Musharraf's local government, system, because I mean, subsequently the democratic governments didn't have much appetite for local governments. But and a lot of money was spent on it, to build capacity, and some of them were doing very interesting work. I mean, in Jodhawala, in Karachi, big cities like Karachi. But that entire system had to be thrown out. So depending on now who's coming to the fore in 6 months from now. I mean, I don't think November is going to happen. I mean, although the president has indicated, but I mean, he's on his way out, and the election commission is supposed to be finalizing the constituencies. So let's see when elections are held. Let's see who comes to the fore. I mean, it could be speculation is it could be a very fragmented coalition. But these ideas, I think anything that happens now will not have significant longevity, nor will it have the gestation to make a real difference on the real complex issues.
Fair enough, fair enough. So let's assuming that elections do not happen in November, or even otherwise, how do you think the West, the Western part of the world and other countries view this arrangement in Pakistan?
I don't think that there's, given the state of the world, I mean, if we look at, in our neck of the woods, Sheikh Hasina, for instance, has, she's been in power for a while now. Khaleda Zia has, and the BNP are still being heavily persecuted. I mean, the US doesn't like it. Didn't call them, I think, to the second summit of democracy in Sri Lanka. The Rajapaksas have gone away, but they still exert influence. They have elections coming up. In India, of course, I mean, India is rising, but is also being used for counterbalancing, China. But there's increasing recognition that here is not the mother of democracy. Here, what we have is an illiberal democracy. So, so let's engage with them with, real politic considerations in mind. So, given how countries like the US or China engage with the rest of the world. I mean, yes, there'll be, calls for democracy, but essentially at the end of the day, they will engage with whoever is in power, right? And there are some, some narratives which are more convenient, for the external stakeholders. I think the US is also quite used to engaging with the Pakistani establishment, and so is China. So I do not really, see the fate of, the bilateral relations with these two key partners, sort of hanging on when the elections are going to be held. There are, of course, domestic, considerations. The establishment might be, might send out testers to see what the political temperature is like, what the volatility situation is like, what the sentiment of the people is like. And those might be more sort of determining factors for when to hold elections to get, desirable results. But I think external pressure would not be a deciding factor. I don't know how the IFIs are gonna, take to this. But again, the IFIs also have the countries like the US have immense sway with the IFIs as well. So, one cannot, I mean, make definitive comments on things like this. There's a lot of moving parts to them. But I think that, just because, the White House was initially quite cautious in its statements, because it didn't again want to be seen as being a puppet master, right? But and they are making some interesting diplomatic moves. I mean, we had the American ambassador, when he went and visited Prime Minister Kakar, had also gone to the election commission at the same time, right? So these, I mean, these sort of more diplomatic measures aside, when push comes to shove, I mean, for the US, for instance, I mean, it's like, engaging with Afghanistan, particularly on things like CT. which is the ball is in the military
Yeah.
establishment's court, right? I mean, sort of, not having a meltdown with India, which is also ironic because at the same time they are building Indian capacity, and then, hoping that somehow, it won't antagonize and make Pakistan more insecure. But that's another concern. The nuclear issue is another concern, right? And they don't want dismal, absolute chaos in Pakistan either, because it's a very large country with a large population base, with sort of, also problems like rising,
Yeah.
extremism, etc. It's got the bombs. So those are, I think, the American concerns right now. There's not a lot of interest in Pakistan, especially after the Afghan pullout. But these factors are factors that sort of anyone can deliver
Yeah.
on, and these are the long-term engagements that the US is going to sort of, be watching for.